Last time, we covered the origins of what would become known as the Douglas Aircraft Company. We followed the story of Donald Douglas, from his earliest days with the Davis Douglas Cloudster, to the record-setting and fame-earning Douglas World Cruisers, and onwards to a series of highly successful military designs that gave his company a strong technical and financial foundation. This foundation was then strengthened with the company's move to newer and larger facilities in Santa Monica, which also coincided with its reorganization, going from the Douglas Company and becoming the Douglas Aircraft Company in 1929. And this is where we pick things up. Today, we will take a look at what could be described as Douglas's Golden Age, a time when the company went from strength to strength, and during which it saw massive growth. This period goes from 1929 until the end of 1945, and during this time a lot, and I mean a lot of aircraft were designed and built by the company. Because of this, we won't cover any particular aircraft in detail like we had in part 1 of this video series, as they will get their own videos in the future, and also because it would make this video about 10 hours long and I prefer to keep my sanity, but we will cover them in passing, as understanding the success or failure of many of these aircraft are critical to understanding the history of the Douglas Aircraft Company as a whole. We will also spend a little more time looking at Douglas himself, his family and close associates, some of whom had big parts to play in his company's history. So, let's kick things off in 1929. After settling into their new home, the Douglas staff continued production of its observation biplanes for the US military, and also begun production of the PD-1 flying boat, a design that they had inherited from the Naval Aircraft Factory. But more change was also on the wind. Not only did the year see the Douglas Aircraft Company reformed and relocated, but it also saw its designs modernize into the emerging world of the all-metal monoplane, and this began with a little flying boat that would become known as the Douglas Dolphin. The Dolphin was the combination of Douglas's passion for aircraft design and his love for the open sea, a love that had not diminished despite his now ever-busy career. Every weekend in the late 1920s, the Douglas family would go out on the Barbara Jean, a 40-foot schooner which he had named after his young daughter. They often visited Catalina Island, and Douglas entered the inter-island races each year, often winning, and he spent many spare hours teaching his two sons, Donald Jr. and William, the finer arts of seamanship and navigation. It was during these weekend holidays that he realised that there was probably a market for a luxury flying boat, as much as there was a market for private yachts, especially with the way that the economy was booming in the late 20s. And so, he dropped plans for a twin-engine flying boat that he called the Douglas Sinbad. The Sinbad represented several firsts for Douglas. It was the company's first cantilever monoplane, it was Douglas's first attempt at a flying boat, and it was the first twin-engine aircraft design that was fully drawn up in-house. Like many of the new monoplane flying boats that were starting to emerge during this time, the Sinbad had high-mounted wings, and even higher-mounted engines, to keep both the sensitive equipment and the propellers clear of any water. These were a pair of 300 horsepower Wright whirlwinds that were enclosed in metal cowlings that sloped down into the wing structure, and it was with these engines that the Sinbad made its first flight in July of 1930. Unfortunately, by the time that the prototype Sinbad was completed, the economy of the late 1920s had gone from boom to bust, following the Wall Street crash. Luckily for Douglas, the company's strong ties with the Army and Navy now proved their worth, and the flying boat was saved from being a total loss. While the Sinbad was being tested, Douglas had already decided that the production model would be completed as an amphibian, to make it more appealing to both civil and military customers. It also received a new name, the Dolphin. These aircraft were fitted with retractable undercarriages comprising of a main gear attached to the hull, and a tailwheel replaced the skids on the tail. In flight or for water operations, the main gear was raised by shortening the oleo legs, thus lifting the wheels above the waterline, while the tailwheel pivoted upwards until it was close up to the bottom of the hull. While only 58 Dolphins were built between 1931 and 1934, this total included 17 different variants and models, as the Dolphins were either custom built for each civil customer or produced in small batches for military and commercial buyers. Now, while the Douglas Cloudster and the M-planes had been used to carry passengers in the past, neither type had been originally conceived for that purpose. Because of this, the Dolphin, even though it was produced in small numbers, occupies a special slot in the company's history, as it was the first passenger-carrying commercial transport to be put into mainline production. Furthermore, during its many years of service with various bodies, such as the US Army Air Corps, the US Coast Guard, the US Marine Corps, the US Navy, and, surprisingly, the Royal Australian Air Force, the Dolphin earned a solid reputation for its reliability and good handling. In particular, the Dolphin was found to be incredibly useful when conducting air-sea rescue operations, and a couple of Dolphins that were used by the Army Air Corps in the late 1930s helped to pioneer new air-sea rescue techniques that would be used by both the Army, the Navy, and the Coast Guard. Of the various civil owners of the Dolphin, two of them stand out in particular. One Dolphin was built for Armand Esders, who is famous for his love of Bugattis and Rolls-Royces. When he walked into Douglas's office in 1933, Donald Douglas had no idea who he was, and he was surprised when the relatively young-looking man asked to buy one of his aircraft. Donald cautiously advised that they were quite expensive, but his reserve quickly gave way to shock as Esders produced a check for $57,000, asking if that would be enough to cover the cost of a Dolphin. Considering the Dolphin was advertised at just $45,000, it was more than enough. The reason for the extra-large check was quickly made apparent as Esders asked for a string of custom features for his aircraft, including fancier seats, a small bar, and various other glittery features. And Douglas assured him that he could have any special features he wanted within reason, so long as he could finance it. And so not long after this, Esders became one of the first people in the United States, at least, to get an executive aircraft precisely tailored to their needs. The other notable owner of a Dolphin was one William E. Boeing, the founder of the Boeing Company, and soon-to-be Douglas's biggest rival when it came to commercial aircraft. Ironically, the Dolphin that was bought and used by Boeing is the only one that happens to survive up until this day, and it's on display in Coast Guard livery at the National Museum of Naval Aviation in the United States. Though the onset of the Great Depression had been almost fatal for the Dolphin's success, the steady stream of military contracts kept the Douglas Aircraft Company alive and financially solvent during a time when many other companies were going bankrupt. It also allowed the company to continue its trend towards modernization. Douglas Aircraft had been gradually improving its series of observation biplanes, which had started with the O2. But as the 20s gave way to the 30s, it became clear that a monoplane design would be very soon required. Douglas knew that any military orders would probably be smaller in comparison to those for the O2, owing to constrained budgets in the wake of the Great Depression, but he wanted the company to remain as the Air Corps' primary supplier of observation planes, and that meant keeping up with the times. And so, with a mix of reserve and optimism, the company invested in and then submitted a design for a new monoplane observation aircraft, of which, to their relief, two prototypes were then ordered by the Army as the XO-31. At the same time as this, and in response to the twin-engined Fokker XO-27, Douglas also designed a twin-engine observation aircraft that would be known as the XO-35. This aircraft would never serve in its intended role, as the Army decided it was far more suited as a light bomber, and indeed what became known as the B-7 was only built in small numbers and would only see limited use. It would, however, be involved in a few interesting events, such as the airmail crisis, but that has already been covered in a dedicated video on the Douglas B-7 itself, so for further information on that particular aircraft, I recommend you watch that video later. The link will be up on the screen. Following a protracted development, where the XO-31 terrified pilots with a complete disregard for the concepts of aerial stability, things were eventually ironed out in the subsequent O-43A, which was ordered in 1933. This aircraft featured a sliding canopy that enclosed the tandem cockpits. It had an externally braced gull wing, and it was powered by a 675 Curtiss Conqueror. Though it was a monoplane, it was still something of a halfway house between the older designs of the 1920s and the more modern aircraft that would become synonymous with the 1930s. Because of this, only 23 of these would be produced before things moved on to the O-46. This improved the design by bracing the wings with parasol struts instead of fragile external wiring, and the engine was swapped out for a more reliable Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp radial. All in all, the Air Corps would order approximately 90 of the O-46s, which would be delivered between 1936 and 1937. A proposal for yet another improved variant, to be designated as the O-48, was considered, but this design was never built, and the O-46 would end up becoming the last major variant of observation aircraft that would be built by Douglas. This was because the needs of the Army were shifting, and a new aircraft type was being developed to reflect this, the liaison aircraft. These were small, unarmed planes designed to fill a number of auxiliary roles, such as artillery spotting, commander transport, message relay, air ambulance, and light cargo transport duties. None of these future aircraft, some of which would be built in huge numbers, would end up bearing the Douglas name. But this loss of business made little odds, as by the late 1930s, the Douglas Aircraft Company had established itself firmly in other, far more profitable markets. At the start of the decade, thanks to the O-2 and its derivatives, and other designs such as the C-1, the O-43, and the XT-3D, there was no Great Depression as far as the Douglas Aircraft Company was concerned. As 1930 opened, the company had just under 100 aircraft on order, the majority of which were for the United States Army or Navy, and although sales did drop during the next 2 years, the financial position of the company in 1933 was still excellent, with cash and marketable securities of $1.5 million against just $200,000 in liabilities. This wealth of funds put the Douglas Aircraft Company in a fairly unique position during the early 1930s. It was one of the few companies that was A, large enough, and B, solvent enough to react to a sudden shift that occurred in the commercial aviation industry within the United States. Douglas had not abandoned his early ambition to produce a commercial airliner. But even before 1930, he had realized that the commercial air industry, as it was, had its limitations and was deeply flawed. Thus far, airline operators had relied heavily on government subsidies just to break even, let alone make a profit. And this put an emphasis on cheapness, which of course limited your design options and had knock-on effects when it came to, reliability and safety. Additionally, most commercial aircraft of the time carried no more than 10 or maybe 12 passengers at a stretch, which meant that routes had to be flown cheaply, quickly, and very often to be able to justify themselves financially. This meant that most aircraft were flown hard, flown fast, and wore out very quickly, which led to a string of accidents throughout the 1920s. And so by the end of the decade, the popularity of air travel had not exploded as quickly as some, such as Douglas, may have initially expected. But all of this changed in 1931. On March the 31st of that year, a Fokker trimotor, which was carrying a beloved football star and coach, Knute Rockne, crashed in Kansas, killing all 8 people aboard, including Rockne himself. The accident and his death was printed across headlines all across the nation, and pretty much a state of national mourning took hold of the American public. However, the national state of grief quickly gave way to a national state of public anger at the obsolescence and total lack of safety when it came to commercial airliners. The effects of this accident were far-reaching. The details of commercial air accidents were no longer allowed to be kept secret. The Fokker trimotor fleet was grounded, to be followed by a slew of expensive modifications to bring them up to spec, and it was held in common belief that aircraft utilizing wood in their construction were far too accident-prone to be allowed for commercial air travel routes. In the wake of that accident, and following scrutiny by both sensationalists and more sensible heads, flying by air was generally deemed to be the least safe mode of transport in 1931 when comparing planes with trains, automobiles, ships, or even horses. And airline companies very quickly realized that their very survival was on the line and they needed to rapidly acquire better and safer planes. This is, of course, the start of a chain of events that would eventually lead to the development of the Douglas DC family of aircraft. But before we get into that, a bit of additional context is required to understand the full story. The success of the DC-1, and thus the DC-2 and the DC-3, was the result of a few contributing factors. As mentioned previously, Douglas Aircraft was in a good financial position. They had ready cash available, security in the form of existing contracts with the United States military, and although the company had gone public, Douglas still maintained a strict financial policy. Development costs had to be absorbed within a year, and overruns were almost non-existent. Thus, his company had the money on hand to react to a sudden change in market requirements. That's contributing factor number 1. Then there were the airlines themselves. Following a series of reforms that massively shook up the airline industry in the late 1920s, a topic that's far beyond the scope of today's video, but could ironically be summarized as multiple attempts to prevent monopolies, accidentally resulting in the forming of new monopolies, there were only 3 major airlines in operation: American Airways, Transcontinental and Western Air, also known as TWA, and United Airlines, with TWA and United being the largest of the 3. These 2 companies often shared lucrative airmail routes, but they were very serious rivals when it came to getting passengers, and both knew that the airline that got a newer and better aircraft first would have a huge competitive advantage. And so, in 1932, when United Airlines announced that they had ordered 60 of the brand new Boeing 247s, a revolutionary design that showed much promise, TWA became somewhat desperate. Especially when Boeing had then told them that they would have to wait for United to get their planes delivered before they could even order any for themselves. That's contributing factor number 2. Then, at roughly the same time as all of this was going on, Donald Douglas had assisted Jack Northrop in setting up the Northrop Corporation, a subsidiary of Douglas Aircraft, with Douglas holding a 51% stake. Northrop was joined by aeronautical engineer Ed Heinemann, a friend of Douglas, who had also done some work for the company, and who had a passion for developing high-performance aircraft. Heinemann was also on very good terms with Douglas's chief engineer, Dutch Kindleberger, and the two frequently exchanged ideas, notes, and reflections on the latest development in aviation tech. Basically, they liked to gossip a lot about planes. This close connection meant that Jack Northrop freely allowed the Douglas team to make use of innovative design features or technology that his team had developed. That's contributing factor number 3. All of these factors would come into play following a letter that had been sent out by one Jack Fry. He was the vice president of operations for TWA, and he was desperate to find a new commercial airliner for his company. So desperate, in fact, that he'd sent letters out and a design brief with to Douglas, Martin, Consolidated, Curtiss-Wright, Sikorsky, and General Aviation. The letter and design brief expressed an interest in the design and then purchase of at least 10 tri-motored transport aircraft, with requests for an approximate timeline for how long it would take to build the prototype and then get it sent out for service tests. This letter, which became what would Douglas later refer to as the birth certificate for the modern airliner, outlined some fairly stringent specifications. It called for a transport that could carry at least 12 passengers, with more legroom than ever offered in previous passenger designs. It wanted a cruising speed of at least 145 miles an hour, a minimum service ceiling of 21,000 feet, and a range of 1,080 miles. Additionally, it should also be able to take off and land on one engine and have a landing speed that didn't exceed 65 miles an hour. Upon receiving said letter, Douglas Aircraft carried out preliminary studies for an aircraft that could meet these requirements. At the time, Douglas's engineering team, with James Dutch Kindleberger as chief and Arthur Raymond as assistant, was well aware of the potential of the Boeing Model 247. But although Douglas himself believed that they should have a go at this project, he initially didn't want it to be their top priority. With the airline industry still in total disarray, and with the economy still looking a bit on the wobbly side, he foresaw that there was the need for maybe 100 of these aircraft for the entire US market, maybe as little as 50. And with military budgets recovering, he expected the company would make far more money from military contracts compared to commercial airliners. Yes, the company technically had the money to invest in both, but he wanted them to be cautious, and he hesitated on giving TWA a direct answer. Now, it is suspected, but not outright confirmed, that Dutch Kindleberger is the one who shifted the balance, and could well possibly be responsible for the DC-1 even existing. He was on good terms with Harold Talbot Jr., who was then chairman of North American Aviation, who also happened to be a major shareholder of Douglas stock. And the day after receiving TWA's letter, Douglas, who was still umming and ahhing about the whole thing, suddenly received an unprompted visit from Mr. Talbot, who promptly convinced him that the project was worth their full investment, and that Douglas Aircraft could possibly corner the market if they played their cards right. And so, putting aside his initial reserve, and drawing on the optimism that Douglas was so often known for, he assembled his design team and decided to go on a gamble and give the project the company's top priority. The full details of their design process, brainstorming, and interesting meetings will be described in a special video on the DC series itself. But, in a nutshell, the team spent several days drawing up the template for what would become the Douglas Commercial 1, aka the DC-1, and Douglas then sent the details to TWA for approval, and very narrowly beat out the competing designs that were being drawn up by Curtiss-Wright, General Aviation, and Sikorsky. The idea for the aircraft to be built as a trimotor was dropped at the insistence of both Kindleberger and Raymond. They argued that the nose engine, A, reduced pilot visibility by far too much, and B, caused far too much noise in the cabin. They would instead acquire the most powerful engines commercially available and couple them with new streamlined cowlings and variable pitch propellers to get the same amount of power. The cabin was to be roomy enough so that the average person could walk down the aisle without stooping, something that you couldn't do with the Boeing 247. It would also utilize the latest ideas and techniques for noise reduction, which was a real point of complaint for passengers during this time, and the DC-1 would utilize a new style of multicellular wing structure that had been developed by Jack Northrop. He had very kindly sent the drawings of this design over to Douglas for free use on any aircraft that he desired. This produced a wing that was both cheap to make but extremely strong, and this would account greatly for the longevity of the DC-1 and its descendants. The design, development, and testing of the DC-1 was a mammoth task for Douglas. Pretty much everything was developed from the ground up, and the team had spared nothing. Douglas himself had insisted on several features that made the DC-1 stand out from the rest. Its broad cockpit windows, which offered excellent pilot visibility, a soundproofed main cabin for passenger comfort, heating ducts for both the passengers and the pilots, a spacious lavatory at the rear of the cabin, and a small galley for the provision of food on longer air routes. Construction of the DC-1 took approximately 9 months, and then, powered by a pair of 690 Wright Cyclones, it made its maiden flight on the 1st of July 1933, taking off from Clover Field in Santa Monica. At first, things appeared to go poorly. The DC-1's engines appeared to struggle and then fail every time it was put into any sort of powered climb, and it took some considerable wrangling to get it back down to Earth in one piece. As it quickly turned out, this was no fault with the DC-1 itself, but rather with the engines, as the Wright Cyclones had had their carburetors installed backwards, which meant that every time the nose of the DC-1 was put up, gravity would starve the engines of fuel. Not exactly ideal. Thankfully, this problem was quickly corrected, and the DC-1 was soon flying again. Its biggest test came in September. One of TWA's conditions for the airliner was that it must be able to take off and land from their airfields with a full load under the power of just one engine. Back then, this was a considerable challenge to overcome, but Douglas were confident that the DC-1 could do it. And so, on September the 4th, the DC-1 took off for a flight from Winslow in Arizona to Albuquerque in New Mexico. After one of the engines had been switched off for the takeoff run, the DC-1 slowly climbed to a cruising altitude of 8,000 feet, and then it successfully completed the 280-mile route under the power of just one engine. Following the successful evaluation of the DC-1, TWA then placed an initial order for 20 improved versions. These had more powerful engines, and had the fuselage lengthened by 2 feet to allow 14 passengers instead of 12, and they would be produced under the designation of DC-2. The first aircraft made its maiden flight on the 11th of May 1934, and it began operating with TWA a week later. In service, the DC-2 quickly established an excellent reputation for itself. To Douglas's immense delight and relief, the DC-2 proved to be faster, more comfortable, and more economical than the Boeing 247, and overnight it became the best airliner flying in the United States. TWA were incredibly pleased with their new aircraft, of course, but they would not be the sole operator of the DC-2 for very long. Boeing had made a critical mistake in limiting the sales of the 247 until their initial order for United had been completed, shutting out other customers from the market. Douglas, on the other hand, reserved the right to sell the DC-2 to any other customers that chose it, so long as the production capacity of their facilities were not exceeded. At first, however, this production capacity was not too large, and it was in fact very expensive. After going over the numbers, Douglas was predicted to make a net loss on its first production of 20 DC-2s for TWA, and it had all come down to man-hours. Each DC-2 was essentially being hand-built, and it took over 59,000 man-hours to produce just a single aircraft, which represented a huge cost. Donald Douglas and his factory superintendent, George Strumpel, who'd been with him since the earliest days, quickly realized that they had but one option. The company had to get some really big hydraulic presses and stamp out the simpler parts like the factories were doing in the automotive industry. The plan worked. The required man-hours to build a DC-2 dropped from 59,000 to just 32,000, and the Douglas Aircraft Company had begun to take its first steps into the world of mass production, becoming one of the first aircraft companies to do so. Nevertheless, the company still made a loss on its initial order for TWA, but this was soon made up by income from many other orders instead. These came from other airlines within the United States military, as well as a number of overseas customers, with Fokker being the biggest foreign buyer, with Anthony Fokker himself acting as a sort of quasi-broker for other European carriers. In all, 3 main commercial versions and 8 military transport versions of the DC-2 would be produced, totaling just under 200 aircraft before production ceased. This far exceeded Douglas's initial prediction of being able to sell maybe 50 planes at most, and as it turned out, the company found itself breaking even on cost after the 75th DC-2 had been built. Though overshadowed by its successor, the DC-3, the DC-2 represented a paradigm shift in the aviation industry, and it was a huge boost to the image of the Douglas Aircraft Company itself. The DC-2's high performance was a particular point of praise, and this was especially highlighted when it came second in a 12,000-mile air race from London to Melbourne. The only aircraft to actually beat it there was a specially built de Havilland DH-88 Racer, And the flight gained worldwide attention because the DC-2 had so thoroughly outclassed competing designs by both Boeing and Lockheed, and other overseas manufacturers as well, that some wondered why they'd even shown up. Because of this, the DC-2 was declared the best commercial aircraft in the world, and later in 1936, Douglas was awarded the Collier Trophy, aviation's highest award, by President Roosevelt at the White House for its development. This development had not been cheap. The design and testing of the DC-1 and the placing into production of the DC-2 had tied up more than $2 million, of which $450,000 had been raised by loans. This represented a gamble by Douglas, as cash and marketable securities held by the company had dropped from $2 million in 1932 to just $650,000 in 1934, with about a quarter of that being pledged as collateral for the loans. At the same time as this, disappointing results achieved with the Dolphin, and reduced government orders, resulted in a drop in net income, going from an all-time high of $690,000 in 1930 to just $34,000 in 1934. Furthermore, the heavy cost of the DC-1 and the DC-2 development programs had forced Douglas to modify, for the first time, his company's policy of writing off the development cost of an aircraft within 1 year. And the development cost of this program was spread over the financial years of 1934 and to 1935. Because of this, only one other aircraft was developed by the company during the period that spanned from 1932 into mid-1934, and that was the XO2D1. This was the company's last biplane design, and it's perhaps one of their least known designs in general. Probably because it was a total failure. It was designed for a Navy competition to build a new scout plane to serve aboard cruisers and capital ships, and this was a competition in which it lost to the Curtiss XO3C1, which was the prototype for the SOC Seagull, another aircraft that we've already covered on this channel. Fortunately for Douglas, this didn't really affect things when it came to its reputation with the Navy, as several promising projects were already on the horizon, and even more fortunately, the heavy financial outlays of the DC-2's development were slowly being offset by a promising future. By the end of 1934, the company had contracts in progress that were worth $1.5 million, and early in 1935, they received delivery payments that amounted to approximately $600,000. With production of the DC-2 underway, more resources could now be spared towards the development of other aircraft types. Between the end of 1934 and the end of 1935, the company designed the XP-3D flying boat, the XTBD-1, which became the Devastator, which we've covered in its own video, the B-18 Bolo, which we've also covered in a video, and the DST, known as the Douglas Sleeper Transport, which would become the DC-3, which we haven't covered in a video yet, but I'll briefly go over its history now, as it's somewhat critically important to the success of the entire Douglas company in general. So yeah, let's take a quick look at that now. In the case of the DST, and its day transport version, the DC-3, the company actually failed to foresee the true potential market of this machine. Or rather, Douglas was a bit too pessimistic. On the 5th of May 1934, American Airlines had begun a new transcontinental service, going from New York to Los Angeles. This service flew over a longer route than its competitors, and so it offset this competitive disadvantage of the longer route by operating Curtiss Condors equipped with sleeping berths. But with United operating the faster Boeing Model 247, and with TWA rolling out the first of its even more faster DC-3s, it soon became very imperative for American to replace its Condors with something even better. As Douglas was currently wiping the floor when it came to commercial aviation and its competitors, the airline decided to approach them for a new design. They approached Douglas in late 1934 and asked him if his team could design a slightly wider version of the DC-2 that could accommodate sleeping berths for their new transcontinental route. Now, initially, this request was received with only lukewarm enthusiasm, as Douglas underestimated the value for such an aircraft, as these transcontinental routes were not particularly popular or profitable quite yet, and also because American was slightly concerningly short on cash owing to the unprofitability of said routes. But following a long telephone call between the president of American Airlines and Donald Douglas himself, during which an order for 20 aircraft was verbally promised in a sort of gentleman's agreement, Douglas decided to agree to the undertaking. At first, Douglas and American planned the DST as a minimum change version of the DC-2, with the two aircraft having about 85% common parts. However, it soon became necessary to abandon this conservative approach, and ultimately the DC-3 only used about 15% of the parts and components that were found on the DC-2. While this design philosophy resulted in a significantly higher engineering and manufacturing cost, it enabled Douglas to produce an aircraft capable of a great variety of civil and military roles. First flown in December of 1935, the initial DST could accommodate 14 passengers in its nighttime configuration, or 28 when used as a day transport. 14 wide double seats could be made up into 7 lower berths, and 7 upper berths folded down from the ceiling. These upper sleeping areas necessitated the installation of 4 small upper windows on each side of the main cabin, and this made the DST easy to distinguish. Initially, the first DST was only followed by about 37 other aircraft designed as sleeper transports. This limited production would have justified Douglas's earlier misgivings about the popularity of the type, but he was soon very much stunned by the rapidly growing popularity of the DST once it entered service, and this very quickly led to follow-up orders, and even more success would follow with the day transport version that had been designated as the DC-3. Within just 6 months of entering service, the new aircraft were already surpassing the commercial success of the DC-2. By the end of 1936, American Airlines had received 7 DSTs and 13 DC-3s. The first export aircraft had been sold to Fokker, and other orders were piling up at an incredible rate. In the United States, American Airlines was quickly followed by Eastern and United, who began operating the DC aircraft in 1937, and between then and 1940, 8 other major US carriers added either the DST or the DC-3 or both to their fleets. The popularity of these aircraft grew at such a pace that by late 1941, of the 322 aircraft operated by the US domestic airline fleet, 260 of them were aircraft built by Douglas. The success of the DC aircraft was a direct reflection of the huge impact it had on the quality of air travel, which thus had an impact on the growth of the market. In 1934, the flight between New York and LA took 25 hours and 55 minutes. It involved a change of airlines, 2 changes of aircraft, and 15 stops. But when American introduced the DST, it was able to offer a single plane 3-stop service, which only took 17 hours and 30 minutes to complete. And this was a reduction in time of approximately 1/3, which was huge. Additionally, flying itself was far more enjoyable. Before the DC series, it was not uncommon for passengers to put either wax or even cotton balls into their ears to protect themselves from the loud noise of the aircraft's engines. Now, in the DC-2 and the DST and the DC-3, people could not only preserve their eardrums, but they could even engage in conversations that didn't require shouting. Not only did the DC-3 prove to be reliable and safe, but it also became the first airliner to return a true profit without the support of mail contracts or other forms of government subsidies. Unsurprisingly, the DC's popularity quickly skyrocketed. The company quickly received orders from most major European nations, as well as the Soviet Union and Japan, and members of the Commonwealth, and domestically within the United States, the DC-3's popularity introduced a whole new segment of the population to the new and exciting world of comfortable and safe air travel. The numbers really did speak for themselves. In 1935, the year before the DC-3's entry into service, the US domestic passenger mileage was 267 million miles per year. But in 1941, this had increased 5 times to 1.3 billion miles per year. But this growth was now receiving a check. By this point, overseas demand for the DC-3 had dropped off considerably due to the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe. In many areas, the airline services that had not been outright cancelled became an extension of the government and military transport systems, hauling troops, cargo, and mail. In the process, many of the European DC-3s were impressed directly into various armies or air services, where they would soon be joined by thousands of their military derivatives. Meanwhile, other DC-3s, especially in the United States and in various neutral countries, continued to operate until the end of the Second World War, where they were then joined by a massive influx of surplus aircraft, which would launch the aviation industry into an even more massive period of growth. But that's a topic for later. Putting aside the glory of the DC-3, it's important to take a look at the rest of the company's history in the lead up to America's involvement in the Second World War. The period of 1935 to 1940 was one of huge growth for the Douglas Aircraft Company. Net sales increased from 8.5 million in 1935 to almost 61 million in 1940. Net income went from 1.2 million to 10.8 million, and cash and marketable securities held by the company went from 1.7 million to 26 million. Also significant was the fact that, due to the increasing volume of commercial business, sales to the US Armed Forces, which up to and including 1933 represented 90% of Douglas's total sales, now only accounted for 54% of the company's total revenue between 1922 and 1939. But this growth did not only solely revolve around that of the DC-2 and the DC-3 transports. There were other factors at play as well. Not only did Douglas continue to work on various military, civil, and experimental designs, but the company had also acquired a new production facility. In 1932, John Northrop had formed the Northrop Corporation as a subsidiary company under Douglas, with Douglas holding a 51% stake, as I mentioned earlier. Its main production plant was established near the corner of Imperial Highway and Aviation Boulevard in El Segundo. Between 1932 and 1937, several different types of aircraft were produced there under the Northrop banner. Things such as the Delta, the Gamma, and the A-17 to name a few, all of which will be covered in its own video later. But in 1937, the company began to experience labor problems. These problems became so serious that the War Department then refused to work with the company until they were resolved. Douglas attempted to correct these issues by buying out the rest of Northrop and reorganizing it, but these efforts ultimately failed, and John Northrop would part ways to form a fully independent company, Northrop Aircraft Inc., in 1939. The Douglas Aircraft Company kept the facilities that had been left by Northrop, and these were reorganized into the El Segundo division. The company had also inherited Ed Heinemann, who had worked with Douglas before, then with Northrop, and was now back in the fold with the Douglas once again. He would lead the team at El Segundo, which would soon become known for a successive series of carrier-borne aircraft that they built for the US Navy, beginning with the BT-1, earning glory with the SBD Dauntless, and culminating with the venerable A-4 Skyhawk. El Segundo would also provide the manpower and resources that would go into building other projects, such as the experimental Douglas XB-19, a truly massive superbomber whose expensive and innovative story has already been covered in its own video on this channel. Now, to further clarify why this video focuses more on the company rather than the aircraft, here is a list of the major designs that were either produced, or at least in the early development phase, between 1935 and 1940. There was the DC-1, the XO-2D-1, and the DC-2, of course. There was also the YO-A5, the TBD Devastator, the B-18 Bolo, the Big XB-19, the A-8, formerly A-17, the BT-1, the DC-3, the C-47, the DF, the SBD Dauntless, the DC-4E, which eventually led to the DC-4, the DB-7, the A-20, and the B-23 Dragon. Needless to say, the company was kept very busy, and if I were to go over that in detail, it would take literally a day, and this busyness was also reflected in the life of Donald Douglas himself. Now a father of 5, he faced an endless struggle to balance the responsibilities of parenthood and that of running a rapidly growing business. From 1935 onwards, the family vacations that had marked many weekends of his earlier years became exceedingly rare, and Douglas found himself putting in long hours, managing up to a dozen different projects at once, and overseeing the general running of the company. His wife and children were of course completely supportive, and indeed, his daughter Barbara attended many public events, christened various aircraft, and in general took over a lot of the public relations roles that her shy mother was more than happy to surrender. But on the whole, the success of the business had led to a strain in the family relationship. Now, this certainly had an influence in the explosive fight between Donald Douglas Sr. and Donald Douglas Jr. that occurred in 1938, and for the purpose of simplicity, we will refer to Sr. as Douglas and Jr. as Don. Naturally, in these more traditional times, the argument was because dear father did not approve of his son's choice for a wife. In fact, Douglas was so furious that the wedding went ahead that he all but disowned his son and refused to let him come and work for the family business. Don Jr., though vastly different from his father in personality, had at least inherited his father's more practical traits. He quickly landed a teaching job at the Curtiss Wright Institute. There, he developed innovative teaching aids to assist students who struggled with reading technical blueprints. From his own upbringing, he understood that people learn differently, and a mix of physical, visual, and spoken teaching techniques made his classes some of the Institute's most successful during his tenure. But as much as he enjoyed it, Don could not settle down with his wife on the modest salary that teaching at the Institute provided. And so, 3 years after all but severing ties with his father, he walked into the Douglas Employment Office and applied for a job. Going directly to Papa Dearest himself was of course out of the question, and Don wanted to get in on his own merits anyway, but his father clearly recognized that his estranged son had promise because Don's application was accepted, and all of them at the time were going over Douglas's desk. He would spend the war years working on several projects, notably the C-54 transport, but Don Jr.'s time would not truly come until after the war years, and that will be discussed in more detail in Part 3. Getting back to the company itself, a big milestone was celebrated in 1939, which marked Douglas's 25th anniversary in the world of aviation. To celebrate the event, Donald Douglas decided to host a private party in the skies, and the platform selected for this was the company's newest flagship, the Douglas DC-4. It circled the cities of Santa Monica and Los Angeles during the afternoon and evening, where the company had grown and prospered, and Douglas was joined in the air by his father, close friends, and several of the original founding members of the company, names such as Bill Henry, David Davis, Henry Guerin, and George Strompel. In the previous 5 years, the company's growth had been phenomenal. The number of employees had grown by 10 times, reaching a total of 9,000, and Douglas Aircraft had achieved international success on a level that Douglas himself would have considered fantasy just a few years previously. But this happy achievement and this happy year was marred by 2 things. The outbreak of the war in Europe was about to present a litany of logistical challenges for the company, and Douglas himself realized that his country's involvement in this war would be a matter of when, not if. And then, in December of 1939, he learned that Anthony Fokker, one of his closest friends, had suddenly died after a short illness. Douglas and Fokker had been good friends from the outset. They both shared a love for sailing and the sea in general. Both were passionate designers of aircraft, and yet they never considered each other as true rivals, though they both built commercial designs, and Fokker's death deeply upset him. It left a lasting impression, reminding Douglas of the fragility of life and the importance of legacy, and this was one of the things that would drive him to remain involved with the company until his final days. Though he deeply missed his friend, Douglas was soon forced to put grief aside, as the busiest period of his life and his company was about to begin. The war years began with Douglas Aircraft in a very strong position. 1939 marked the company's 11th and most profitable year. It had achieved a net income of just under $3 million, and its backlog of orders had grown considerably. In 1929, the company's backlog was worth $2.3 million. This had then grown to $31 million by 1937, and then it had more than doubled to almost $69 million by the end of 1939. The breakdown of this backlog painted a clear picture of the sudden shift in political climates, and the violent reality being faced by much of the world. 58% of Douglas's orders were now for export orders for military aircraft, 34% were for the US War Department itself, and just 8% were for the civil and commercial markets. By this point, the DC-2 and DC-3s were used by all the major airlines in the United States, and by 18 major airlines overseas. They were being built domestically and under license, but they did not dominate the Douglas production lines in 1939 as much as some would expect. That would come with the C-47 Skytrain starting in 1941. No, in 1939, the bulk of Douglas's production was focused on the export DB-7, the A-20, the B-18 and the B-23 for the Air Corps, and the TBD Devastator for the Navy, with the company also tooling up for the production of the SBD Dauntless. But with the war in Europe rapidly escalating, spreading into the Mediterranean and into Africa, and with the worsening political situation with Japan, the production and development of Douglas's military planes skyrocketed as the US Army and Navy began to place massive orders. Orders which the company had zero chance to meet with its current facilities. This was a problem faced by the entire industry as orders piled up by the thousands for both export and domestic aircraft, and when in May of 1940 President Roosevelt called for the production of no less than 50,000 aircraft per year, the US government initiated its Emergency Plant Facilities Program. This is a topic that will get its own video, as the logistics behind it are staggering and remarkably interesting. But in a nutshell, the aircraft manufacturers would build whatever facilities they needed, and the US government would reimburse them over a period of 5 years. Following this, they would then assume ownership. This meant that the government didn't financially cripple itself on day one by financing several dozen factories at once, and it meant that the manufacturers could later be relieved from assuming the risk of possessing an expensive and excessive amount of factory space after the war had wrapped up. For Douglas, this led to the development of their Long Beach facility, which was built adjacent to the Long Beach Municipal Airport. As work on this new factory got underway, Douglas received the first of several massive orders for the C-47, the military version of the DC-3, along with follow-up orders for the A-20. These were produced at the Santa Monica facility, and over at the El Segundo division, the production of the SBD Dauntless was dramatically accelerated, and, several thousand miles away, the temperature in the command bridges of several Japanese fleet carriers magically dropped by several degrees. In November of 1931, the Long Beach plant would begin its operations, with its first aircraft assembled being a C-47DL. Attending its grand opening was the massive XB-19 experimental bomber, and the scale of this flying behemoth was an excellent reflection on the capabilities of Douglas's new factory. During the next 3.5 years, the Long Beach plant would produce variants of the C-47, the A-20, the A-26, and the B-17, all at the same time. By the end of the war, its production capacity had far outpaced all other Douglas facilities, and Long Beach alone produced some 9,439 aircraft, or roughly 9 every day around the clock during its operations. Meanwhile, Douglas's main plant at Santa Monica continued production of the C-47, the A-20, and the new C-54 Skymaster. But it also housed most of the company's design facilities, and so it oversaw the production of new designs as well. Some of these new designs drawn up included the XB-42 Mixmaster, which later evolved into the jet-powered XP-43. Work began on the XC-112 project, which sought to develop a larger and pressurized version of the DC-4 as a military transport, which would eventually emerge after the war as the DC-6, and numerous other design experiments were initiated that would bear some interesting results in the post-war period. Though Douglas Aircraft was now pumping out a frightening amount of airframes across its 3 big facilities, it was still not enough to keep up with the urgent demands of the Allied forces, for which Douglas was now becoming the main supplier. Because of this, the company once again turned to the US government to assist with the construction of even more production facilities, and this resulted in the sponsored construction of factories in Chicago, Oklahoma City, and Tulsa. Used exclusively to supplement the Santa Monica plant in C-54 production, the Chicago facility began operations on October 1, 1943. Likewise, the Oklahoma City plant was used exclusively for the production of the C-47, but the Tulsa plant, which had initially been intended for contracted production of the B-24 Liberator, instead found itself producing the Douglas A-26 and the A-24 Banshee, which was an Army Air Force version of the Navy's SBD Dauntless. The result was that by the end of the war, Douglas was one of the 2 biggest aircraft manufacturers in the entire United States. North American aviation had produced more airframes, churning out 41,000 versus Douglas's 31,000, but Douglas had produced more in terms of pure mass. From January 1, 1940 until December 31, 1944, the company had produced 140,000 tons worth of aircraft, which was 15% of the entire nation's production during the war. On its own, this was a deeply impressive feat, but this production had also brought with it a lasting legacy. Douglas was already a well-known name by the time that the war had arrived, but now it was firmly solidified as one of aviation's all-time greats. In the early, desperate opening year of the Pacific War, the Douglas SBD Dauntless fought in every major naval battle. It sank 300,000 tons of Japanese shipping, more than any other aircraft, and is credited with the sinking, or the assistance of sinking, 15 transports, 1 submarine, 6 destroyers, 14 cruisers, a battleship, and 6 aircraft carriers, many of which were sunk at Midway, which was the Dauntless's most famous action of the Pacific War. The Douglas A-20 Havoc established itself as a reliable, strong, and surprisingly nimble attack aircraft. It was easy to learn and it was beloved by British and Soviet pilots especially. In fact, the Soviet air forces eventually operated more A-20s than the Americans did themselves. And, of course, there was the C-47 Skytrain, of which over 10,000 were built. This wartime version of the DC-3 was utterly vital to the logistical success of many Allied campaigns, in particular those in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, where reliable aerial supply was of critical importance. It was a frequent sight all over the world, hauling supplies, troops, wounded personnel, or even towing invasion gliders, and the Skytrain was considered to be the most influential non-combat aircraft of the entire war. These aircraft and others had solidified the reputation of what was now a truly massive enterprise. At the height of its wartime production, the Douglas Aircraft Company employed over 160,000 employees, and in 1944 alone it produced $1 billion worth of aircraft. It had risen to the challenge of wartime demands, and it had exceeded all expectations. But, as it would turn out, the first years of a new peace would prove to be just as difficult as those of war. Donald Douglas and his company would face 3 major challenges in the late 1940s. Firstly, the cancellation of all major government orders following VJ Day would lead to a massive reduction in the company workforce, with over half of the staff laid off within a matter of weeks. Secondly, the company, like several others, found itself playing a hasty game of catch-up, as much of America's aviation industry had lagged behind technologically, as they had focused on producing as many existing aircraft as possible during the war, rather than focusing on innovating new things. The advent of the jet engine, the development of pressurized cabins, and many other innovations meant that the competition between airliners had essentially been reset in the post-war period. Douglas couldn't rely on the advantages it had before the war, and with reliable military contracts disappearing overnight, it had to be very careful with how it would invest in technology moving forward. And thirdly, Douglas would have to deal with the problem of its own success, which had, strangely enough, come back to bite it. The DC-3 and the C-47 were hugely successful, but following the war, a very large number of these were flooded into the civil market as the military was ditching all of its surplus airframes. This would force Douglas to push even harder to produce new innovative designs, as it was essentially competing with itself. These challenges would open the final chapters in the Douglas story. It would see some of the company's greatest success stories and some of its biggest failures. It would witness the birth of the jet airliner, the wars in Korea and Vietnam, the breaking of the sound barrier, the advent of cruise missiles, the invention of guided air-to-air weapons, advanced radars, early computer systems, and a whole string of other things that would make modern aircraft as advanced as they were costly. It was also a time that would see a change in the guard, a time for Donald Douglas to step back and try to take some of the immense load off his shoulders. But letting go of a company that you'd built up from nothing was easier said than done, and the complex relationship between Douglas Sr. and Jr., the ever-expanding divisions of the company, and the rapidly changing demands of a modernizing world would eventually culminate in a financial apocalypse, with the McDonnell Corporation coming in to the rescue. But that, and more, is all to be discussed next time in the final installment of this video series, where we take a look at the history of Donald Douglas and his aircraft company. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a huge thank you, of course, to the patrons. I apologise that this video is so late coming out. I have been having some health issues, as it turns out. It isn't all long COVID. I have got a chronic reflux condition that might actually require surgery, so that's fantastic news. More updates on that in the future when I have had some more medical tests and tubes poked in me. Hooray. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier patrons, our highest tier members. And a little update on the domestic front. We do now officially have a house to move into later on this year, which is really exciting. Don't have an exact move-in date yet, but at some point between now and Christmas, I should have my own dedicated office space / studio room, which means I can finally begin some projects that I've been holding off on for over a year. So stay tuned for updates on that as well. But, as always, thank you all so much for your continued support, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.